Thank you everyone for joining us today on the Pollinator Report. I'm Justina Block and my company Osmia Bee are thrilled to be partnering with the Cincinnati Zoo and Botanical Garden and Pollination. This is our 5th webinar of our 7-part series, Seasonal Bees at Your Service with Dr. Theresa Pitts-Singer. Please keep an eye on your email for a recording of this webinar and more information on our special guest. And stay tuned for after the webinar for Q&A. I'd like to take a moment to thank our partners and sponsors who helped us promote this event. The USDA, the Cincinnati Zoo and Botanical Garden, a special thanks to Director Thane Maynard, and Pollination, and a special thanks also to Christina Anderson. She's the coordinator of Plant for Pollinator Challenge. I hope you've registered your gardens. And Kroger Simple Truth. Our supporters, ARS, Agricultural Research Services, Green Bean Delivery, Wild Birds Unlimited, Cincinnati, In the Garden with Ron Wilson every Saturday morning on WKRC, Kiss the Ground documentary now streaming on Netflix, Bernheim Arboretum and Research Forest, AJ Ron Greenhouse, and Sherry, the Okra Lady. You can find her on Instagram. Nature Revisited podcast, one of my favorites I listen to all the time. Homesdale, a conscious company. Winberg Landscaping, and Pollination podcasts, Oregon State University Extension Services. Thank you again for your support. It's now my privilege to introduce our guest and friend, Dr. Theresa Pitts-Singer. She's an entomologist at the USDA-ARS Pollinating Insects Research Unit in Logan, Utah. Welcome, and thank you for being our guest on the Pollinator Report.
Hey, Justina, it's so great to be here.
It's great to see you.
Yeah. What a great day. I think I got all the crust out of my eyes. It's early in the morning for me here. Got my coffee. I'm feeling good.
Oh, well, we really appreciate you being here and telling us a little more about an alternative bee to crop pollination. This is going to be a great series for our listeners to know about using solitary bees.
Yeah, hopefully you're going to find it very fascinating and also very beautiful. You know, that's the colorful food plate and the colorful bees that make it happen. So that's my goal today, is to help you see all that.
Oh, that's fantastic. Well, without further ado, let's get started. And let's get started with seasonal bees at your service. Thank you.
Okay, give me a second. I'll start sharing my screen. Okay, so my talk today for you is seasonal bees at your service. And so this is what spring is starting to look like here in Logan, Utah. We're a month or so behind seeing something as beautiful as these cherry flowers. As you already know, bees are very diverse. If you've heard of other talks on this seminar series, you'll know that the diversity of bees is great across the globe, over 20,000 species. And then in North America, there's over 4,000 species. And we rely on bees and pollinators for global food security, for conservation of plants in our wildlands, and also we love them because they're so beautiful and they bring us joy. At the Pollinating Insect Collection, hosted by the USDA in Logan, Utah, there are over 1 million specimens of bees that are used for research. But the bee most everybody knows of are the honeybees. And this is my friend Gordy Wardell out in the orchards of Southern California, the almond orchards, which just finished up blooming probably by now. And so 2 hives per acre are afforded for this activity. So this is what the inside of a honeybee hive looks like. Honeybees are social. So there's a queen inside here that are protected by a bunch of her daughters that are workers. And at certain times of the year, that queen will lay eggs that become drones, which are males. Unfertilized eggs make males, fertilized eggs make females. So a mother can control the sex of her children. So in the colony life, all those workers participate in cooperative brood care. They go out and forage for nectar and pollen. They make the waxy pieces that are used for securing their homes. And then eventually there's about 10,000 bees in a healthy hive. And also honeybees are interesting because they forage on a lot of different kinds of flowers, which makes them a great crop pollinator, and they can be transported around to do this job for people. Another interesting thing about the bees is how they can, in one of these frames inside a beehive, shown here by my friend Jamie Strange, is that they can raise all their brood in these man-made frames. And so in the center of this frame, you see bees that have become pupae inside their cells, and the little white spots are where larvae are growing. And then on the outside of that, the kind of the glistening cells have nectar, which is turning into honey stored in them. And then all these different colored cells on the far reaches of this circle are the different colors of pollens that they've collected and stored. So honeybees are really interesting, but also like kind of at the extreme end of being social. This is what is going on inside of those little cells. This depiction is really what goes on inside one cell at a time, but it shows you the different stages of an egg, of a bee developing from an egg to a larva, which goes through several larval stages being fed by workers directly, then to a last larval stage that spins a kind of a cocoon and a capping, which is what you saw on the previous slide. The larva becomes a pupa and then an adult, and then eventually emerges as an adult worker that spends her early days as a nurse bee that takes care of other sisters, and then eventually goes out and is a forager and lives about 45 days or so. The other bee that most people are familiar with are the bumblebees, which are also social. And so there's a queen, and she lays eggs to make workers, and those workers then help her raise other workers, and at the end of the summer, drones. So they have this colony life and they cooperate in it, but the cycle of life is only 1 year. So the queen will die by the end of the summer. New queens will have been produced and mated, and they will overwinter and start new colonies the next year. So as opposed to the honeybees, where a new queen will stay in a hive while an old queen will leave the hive swarming out to start a new colony. So those queens are very long-lived. So bumblebees, though, can be found in the wild. There's lots of species of them, and they are also commercially reared for crop production. So here you see some places where bumblebees can live. The middle picture is of what's inside a natural hive or colony of bumblebees found in a thicket, or it can be in a hay bale. But here's where bees are nesting in a hollowed out tree. And this over on the right is a watermelon patch where someone has purchased bumblebees that are commercially produced. And there's 4 colonies inside this box that's called a quad, because a quad means 4. And so there's 4 entrances for the 4 colonies, and they're placed intermittently throughout watermelon fields for pollination. They're also used in blueberries and sometimes in pumpkins. But most of our bees, as I hope you already know, are solitary. They have a mother bee, a female, that does everything. She's the queen and the worker. She owns her own nest. Nobody helps her build it, and nobody else lays eggs in it. And these females only live a few weeks, and then they leave behind their brood. They never meet them as adults because those brood have to develop over the summer. They then spend their winters in cocoons and then hatch out the next year. And they can nest above ground and below ground. And some are generalist foragers, meaning they can visit a lot of different kinds of flowers, and others are more specialized, visiting a limited number of flowers or just 1 or 2 specific ones. And they are mostly wild, especially those that nest in the ground, but a few of them can be managed, and we'll talk more about them. Here's just some examples of bees that nest above ground, and this over to the far left are a bunch of cavities excavated by a very specialized bees that uses rock to make their nests in, and they excavate out cavities so that they can do what's inside of these other nests, which is showing you a couple of reeds and then maybe a manufactured nesting tube. But the bees will carve out a hole or find an existing hole where they can place pollen and nectar, lay an egg on it, and then on that pollen and nectar mass, a larva will develop all the way through its life. And they'll use like pith in this top nest, or soil, muddy or wet soil, like in this middle nest, or leaf pieces to kind of partition out individual cells within which the bees will develop. One other thing you'll notice in this middle picture is that in the back of the nest, which is to the left of the nest, you'll find that the provision masses are larger than at the front end of the nest. And that's because the females are placed in the back of the nest. The eggs destined to be females that are bigger, and the females are bigger so that they will need more food to develop. Males are smaller and they're put in the front of the nest. They'll develop faster and they'll hatch out first. So you want the males on the front end to chew their way out first, and then the females come out later. So it's specifically designed this way by the mother bee. Here's just the top level of some of the bee nest, and they can be in your yards and also around agricultural fields. And you may not even notice them or misidentify them as ant mounds. But underneath these holes are cavities that are excavated just for provisioning eggs. And so here's a close-up of an alkali bee provision mass with a developing larva on it. And the mother bee even smears inside of some of those cavities with secretions from her body that protect that cell from moisture coming in or microbes growing in it and it making the bees sick. So it's an amazing city that's under that ground, under that hole that mother bee has created for her babies. And here is the world's most famous ground nesting bee that is managed in Washington State and a couple of specific areas. And in these places, Nomia melandri, the alkali bee, forages on alfalfa and is used for alfalfa seed production. And these bees excavate holes and they make their nest underground. And this bottom picture shows you a bee bed, which is where millions of these nest. And hopefully this next slide will play for you. Here you go, to show you what some of these bee beds look like. I forgot to turn on the sound, but oh no, here it is. I think you can hear it. Their bees are buzzing, or I can hear it. So there's millions of bees buzzing around this area. Some of these bee beds are over 50 years old. Some of them are helped out by a little bit of maintenance. They need irrigation, like water under kind of trickling in that soil, and also salt placed atop of that soil to make it just right for these bees to prefer to nest there. So it's a specialized situation that the bees choose, but they're very persistent and they're fantastic pollinators for alfalfa seed production. So most bees, or the highest diversity of bees, will nest in kind of dry soils like the deserts. So especially in the US, there's high diversity of bees in the desert Southwest. And if you've seen other presentations, Olivia Carroll has talked to you about diversity of bees. And this is a very young Olivia, when her last name was different even. And she's been around a long time and studied these bees out in the desert lands of Utah and elsewhere. I just want to show you some of that diversity of bees because these bees are so spectacular. These bees were taken by personnel at the Bee Museum in Logan. And I'm just going to let you kind of dwell on how amazingly beautiful and diverse these are. These specimens are from all over the world, but some can be in your backyard. Some are super fuzzy. Some are super shiny. Some have very long tongues. The middle top picture here is the long-tongued orchid bee, the cobalt osmia bee on the far right bottom. And this bee on the far left bottom doesn't have a lot of hairs because she doesn't collect pollen and nectar for herself. She's a cuckoo bee. So she steals the nest of other bees. And so she doesn't do the work, she just lays eggs. Just some close-ups of some of those bees I just showed you to show you how some of the specialized hairs, just amazing specimens. Amazing photography too. These are through microscopes. How they can collect so much pollen at one time. And how they can have these glorious exoskeletons that are iridescent and punctate and hard and look like glistening dots in the tropical rainforest where these occur. these orchid bees. This is a male orchid bee. It also has a specialized leg for collecting oils from orchids, and the males use it to attract females. Their long tongues are also used for the long corollas of flowers that they like to visit. But let's talk about pollinators in your food. So this is the USDA food plate. It's very colorful, just like the bees. So we need pollinators for pollinating plants, or bees to visit plants to help reproduce. And so not all flowering plants produce food, but about 75% of the production of food does come from bee pollinated flowers. And those pollinated crops are great sources of vitamins, minerals, and proteins, which really come from, 75% of what's on this plate. The grains are wind pollinated. They don't necessarily need a vector, but most fruits, vegetables, and then the foods that are fed to sources of protein, like alfalfa, are necessary for, or need bees to help produce them. So bees are very important for coloring up our plates. So let's talk about why bees visit flowers and what's in it for the flower, what's in it for the bee. So there's been an interaction between insects and flowers for over 100 million years. And so the bees go to flowers for the nectar that often occurs at the base of flowers, sometimes deep in a corolla. The bees also need the pollen, the protein sources that come off of flowers. But this is also the male part of the flower. And the male part of the flower, the pollen, needs to go to the female part of the flower, which is the stigma, which is in this flower right in the center. And the pollen, since it will go down through that stigma to get down to where the seeds need to be made in the ovaries, and that's the fertilization event for the flower. And once that flower is fertilized, it will develop into the fruit that we love, and in this case, these beautiful red cherries. So who are the pollinators? They're not just bees. There are other insects such as flies and sometimes wasps and butterflies, but there are also bats and birds, and every now and then little mammals, other little mammals. But speaking specifically of the foods we like to eat, some are visited by honeybees, bumblebees, and solitary bees, such as the fruits and nuts that grow on trees and bushes. And for instance, almond is 100% in need of pollinators. And some of these others highly in need of pollinators, such as apple and blueberry, sometimes cherry. And for getting those nice full round strawberries we like to eat, we have to have a lot of pollination events. So they definitely need bees too. For the fruits and vegetables we get out of what we think of as field crops or row crops, also honeybees, bumblebees, and solitary bees are active participants. But some bees are specialized for the cucurbits, which are the cantaloupes, cucumbers, honeydews, and all the different squashes and melons. And that would be the example in the picture are the Peponapus squash bees that visit the squash flowers early in the morning. The males even sleep in the flowers because they close up. The flowers are only open for a day, so they close up. So these bees are very specialized and attuned to this particular type of flower. But for tomatoes and peppers, you also need bumblebees and bees that can vibrate the flowers to release the pollen. There's a special event that has to happen called floral sonication to get the pollen out of those kinds of flowers. So bumblebees are highly specialized for that, but other bees can do it as well. And lastly, there are other pollination events that beget the seeds that we need for planting other plants or for getting oils or for even using in our feeders for our birds during the winter. So alfalfa, asparagus, broccoli, carrots, cauliflower, canola, celery, onion, and sunflower are all plants that need bees to help produce the seeds that we use in our products for food. So let's take a walk around the grocery store. I took these at our local store in Logan, Utah. And so here are beautiful apples, tomatoes, melons. We'll need the seeds from the bees to get the onions. Here you see pears, strawberries, raspberries, blueberries, blackberries. All these need bees. Here are all those peppers that I mentioned that need a floral sonication. And then carrots and onion and asparagus that need seed set from the bees to help produce these foods. And a world without bees means empty shelves of a lot of these crops that we love to eat. We could survive without them, but man, our plates would be really boring. Bees are also responsible for the alfalfa seed. Alfalfa seed is used to grow alfalfa. Alfalfa is fed to dairy cows, from which we get wonderful milk and yogurts, as well as all the varieties of cheeses we love to eat, and as well all the butters we like, and ice cream. And if you're from the Cincinnati area, you're especially grateful because of Grater's ice cream, where you get not only the ice cream, but also the nuts and the fruits that go in it. So we also get soy milk, and almond milk because of almond production. And then the almonds we like to eat plain, roasted, however, and in candies. So I want to specifically talk about these two bees that help to make some of the foods I just talked about. So the blue orchard bee on the left and the alfalfa leaf cutting bee on the right are both bees that are commercially managed for crop production, especially out in the West. There are challenges with commercially rearing these bees, having a supply of them and propagating them so that we continue a supply, how to set up nesting places for them where we want them to be nesting for pollination, how to release them, protecting them from the diseases that bees get, the predators that attack them, parasites that invade them, keeping them around by preventing dispersal or encourage them to stay by retention, protecting them from pesticides that are used to protect the crop. So how do you interplay crop protection and pollinator protection? And then there's still some things we don't know about why bees die as eggs and larvae. So there's still more investigation into that as well. So we'll start with the blue orchard bee and look inside her nest. What you find is just like I showed you before, inside a cavity, there's pollen provisions, there's developing immatures, and then there's the soil partitions that divide the cells. Here in the next row, you see inside a cocoon, you have a large larva that eventually turns into a pupa and an adult. These bees overwinter as adults in cocoons. So here are cocoons still separated by their partitions. Inside there are adult bees. And this is just the bottom rows are just x-rays of bee nest. And at the bee lab, we use a lot of x-ray to diagnose what's going on inside these bee cells to help us understand how to manage them and clean out parasites. For instance, this is a cuckoo bee that's developing down here, and I just recognize it by its cocoon shape. Here's my friend Natalie Boyle, who I think is on today, and she's in the almond orchards looking at floral resources for bees. So she's looking at bloom. We need to make sure that there's plenty of bloom for the bees, as well as soil that they can collect off the ground for making their nests. And so these bees are especially good at pollinating for cherries, almonds, and raspberries and blueberries because they fly at cooler temperatures that honeybees might be reluctant to fly out, and definitely other bees cannot fly at. They're not even available at that time of year. So these bees, because they overwinter as adults in cocoons, can hatch out as soon as the spring weather turns and floral resources start to become available, and they'll go out and start visiting flowers, which is the pollination event. So let's talk specifically about using these bees in as almond pollinators and kind of some of the challenges of that, but just all the work that goes behind using these managed bees. So again, let me remind you of what the pollination event is. The bees visit for nectar and for pollen from these flowers, and we want the pollen to end up interacting with the stigma, the female part, to produce an almond nut. So what makes the blue orchard bee so effective at doing this? And kind of we'll compare it to how a honeybee visits a flower. So first, I just want to point out the scopa, which are these specialized rows of hair on the underside of this female Osmia lignaria, this blue orchard bee. And so she collects her pollen on the underside of her belly here dry. And in this bottom picture, you can see that when she visits the flower to get nectar, she's also visiting to collect pollen. And she wiggles all over this flower so that she can get her body kind of coated in this dry pollen. And if the stigma is under her body, then her wiggling around is definitely going to spread that pollen onto the stigma. Above, if you look at this honeybee, she has collected pollen on her legs and really packed it on there wet. And over here beside her head, you can see those stigma, the female parts. She's not connecting the pollen to the stigma. She incidentally does, because there's a lot of pollen that remains around on her body hairs and doesn't necessarily come off of her legs. But if you can just think about the efficiency of the way they visit the flowers, wiggle around, and how they're collecting that pollen, how more likely it is that that orchard bee would deliver the pollen to the stigma. The orchard bee also moves, interestingly, around the trees themselves. So let me explain a little bit about how almond orchards are set up. I've labeled these rows of almond trees by nonpareil and other varieties. The nonpareil is the target variety of almonds. It's a soft shell almond, and it's what's kind of like the ones that you eat out of the bags that are a nice shape. And so they really want to get these pollinated. And so in order to pollinate an almond tree, you have to go from one variety to another variety. You can't pollinate within a tree. So you have to have all this crossing from one variety to the target variety. And you harvest from all of the trees, but the targeted one is the one that's going to bring the highest dollar. So when the honeybees visit these trees, they tend to stay within a tree, going flower to flower to flower to flower, or tree to tree to tree to tree within the same row, because they're very methodical. They're very programmed, and they're either collecting nectar or they're collecting pollen. They have a job to do, and they're very specific about it. Orchard bees are like crazy ladies. They're all over the place. If you were to release orchard bees in an orchard, you probably would never even see one in there, but they're in there working it. And so you put about 400 females per acre to one colony of honeybees per acre. So those 400 female osmia bees are zooming around doing the equivalent job of one honeybee hive. And so it's just a different level of efficiency and way of visiting trees and flowers that actually, when these interact together, is the best remedy for getting the most efficient pollination and the highest nut set. Very cool. So where do we get these bees? The osmia bees are often trapped from the wild. These are just some kind of old pictures that I have of wild trapping bees in the mountains. You can see they usually come from high elevations. And there's a little bit of problem with this because people who decide, oh, I'm going to be a bee trapper, might go out and get onto areas or lands that they shouldn't be on. Or they're not really paying attention to, are they taking all the bees from this particular place without replacing them? And are they also taking other bees that they're going to throw out and not use, or even wasps that belong to the ecosystem that also use these kinds of cavities? So we don't understand how trapping in the wild affects the whole ecosystem in the area, and something we just want to be careful about. And then also, when we trap bees, say in Utah, and we use them in California, that becomes a management issue if the bees are not adapted to those areas that they're used in versus the areas they came in. So all of those are points of research that we have to look into to make sure that we're doing the best for what we want for pollination, or to have the bees in our backyards versus where they originally came from. We need to understand them. Another way to get bees is to propagate them. And this is an area photo of Wonderful Orchard's giant cages, a 10-acre cage and 2 5-acre cages. They're no longer there, but they were there a few years ago, and it was a huge investment of time and money to put these cages up. And inside these cages, they managed plants, and they made sure that they got watered. In Southern California, water is not an easy thing to get either. It's a high commodity item. So you set up the flowers in the watering system, you set up the bee boxes, and then you release tons of bees into an area that's just nothing but flowers for bees, bees that can't escape, bees that have to use the cavities you give them so that you can harvest the bees. So this was a great system, and they've kind of worked out all the bugs for how to do this. And it might be something that people will pursue in the future for propagating these bees. Maybe without the cages, but with the cages, you don't have to compete with honeybees who love the same resources. Another way to get bees is to, get them to nest in the orchards or in the crops that you're using them. The problem with that is that the flowers come and go really fast in an orchard, and that's not the lifetime of a bee, so she can't produce as many progeny if she runs out of flowers. And also in cropping systems, we have pesticides that are needed for having produce or crop or seeds in the way that we want them for our consumption. There's a lot of labor involved if you're doing large acres. So this is, I think this year these ladies are bundling nesting tubes to put in these little boxes that are hung in the trees. I think we had like 1,500 boxes, and this was just for an experiment because the vastness of the orchards in California. And then you have to figure out a way to release these bees. So you incubate the bees in the lab to get them to hatch out in a few days after you warm them up. You have to have them in some sort of boxes or containers from which they can fly out and disperse amongst the almond trees or cherry trees, and to find those nest boxes that you put out for them. Here's some other ways of doing it. On the left, these PVC tubes are used where kind of smaller nest sites are done in smaller acreage, like in cherries. These pictures are from cherries. But also here again is my friend Natalie Boyle, who has put some osmia bees on top in a specialized box called a hive top incubator on top of a honeybee hive, so that the heat of the honeybees, which is highly regulated, can heat up the orchard bees, so that they, in the middle slide, you can see where they are flying out of the box and coming out in a few days right inside the field. It's just a free field incubator. So this is a patented device. And right now the license is owned by Wonderful Orchards if you're interested in that. Bees also need this moist soil so that they can collect it and use it to partition their nests and seal off the ends of their nest to prevent parasitism and other problems or predators getting in. And one year, Natalie and I were out working in the orchards. We saw that the soil was really dry, and we asked the managers of the orchards to please run a water truck down where the honeybees were, where we knew it could be muddy. And so they did, and once they did, the bees started nesting right away, and it was great. It was right the cure. Next year, Natalie was out in the orchards, and this is a picture she sent me. It's like things were going not as smoothly. It was a big mess, but there was no shortage of mud in that year, and things worked out in the end. This all dried up, but yeah, so you just have to make sure the bees get what they need. So once the bees have nested, they have to be cleaned out to get rid of the dead things or the pesty things. Sort the bees by sex if you want to know how many females you have to release per acre to match your honeybee stock. And this is where the bees are being extracted from paper tubes that are inside these hard cardboard tubes. This can, other nesting materials are a little bit easier to strip out. I don't have exact pictures of that, but there's pros and cons of what kind of materials you use. Here's what the cells look like once they've been extracted. The little tiny particles are actually the frass, the poop that's on the outside of the cocoons that kind of falls off, and you can clean that up. You have to have a place to store your bees that have that need to be in winter storage, so you can properly time the cold days to when you want to hatch them out later in the spring. Bees need about 180 days of cold days. So these are a bunch of wood blocks with bees in it, and towards the bottom shelves you can see the tubes. This is again a Wonderful Orchards, and this is also what can be used as an incubator, these same kinds of chambers. Just the close-up of some of those. They're colored because the people were marking what week the nests were made. They were just trying to understand better how the bees nest. Here's another way of incubating bees. This is smaller chambers and larger containers where the cocoons have been put in there, and then the bees allowed to attach in this thatchy stuff. That these are all male bees, and the males come out first. And if you want to hold the males back, you can put them in a cooler and give them a little bit of honey water to drink while you're waiting on the females to finish hatching out, and then take them all out to the orchard. And then eventually you have almonds, which is the whole point of doing all of that work with the orchard bees. And then the orchard bees will be done. You don't, they're kind of a one-shot deal. You use them in one place at one time. You don't move them around the country like we do honeybees. So let's switch over and talk to the leaf-cutting bees. Leaf-cutting bees, Megachila rotundata, are used for pollination to produce alfalfa and canola seed. They are summer bees, so these are used in summer crops. And they won't visit all crops, like they don't visit sunflowers. They visit certain types of crops, and they fly at high temperatures. So this is what it looks like inside an alfalfa leaf-cutting bee nest, where the bees have used leaf pieces to make cell cups, and then they put pollen and nectar inside here. You can see on X-ray, there's eggs laid on all these provision masses, developing larvae in the next slide, or the next picture. And then these bees overwinter as prepupae. So they are large larvae that spin a cocoon, and they hang out that way throughout the winter. So when you incubate these bees to put them out on the field, it takes about 3 weeks for them to finish their development. So this is a little trickier timing to know when your alfalfa is going to bloom and when you need to start incubating, warming up your bees at kind of warm temperatures to get them out as if it's summer for them. They're the nesting resources they need, they can get from the field. They cut these leaf pieces from alfalfa, and also they love roses, so they'll cut those in mint. And then this is just what some of their nesting block face looks like. They nest in some polystyrene or wood blocks that are provided to them by farmers, and they visit the alfalfa flowers for the nectar and pollen they need. Now, what's really cool about the alfalfa leaf-cutting bee that's different from honeybees is the way it is unbothered by this tripping mechanism that happens on alfalfa flowers. So this top picture on the left here shows like a closed alfalfa flower. And you notice there's no anthers or stigma. There's no reproductive parts in there. So when the bee visits, they put pressure on this kill flower, this dark purple part of the flower, and poof, opens the staminal column. So when that happens, you see this spray of pollen behind this bee that just tripped this flower. And so when she visits, she sticks her head in there to get down in the base of that flower to get nectar. But then she's also collecting all that pollen that just poofed off, but also is getting all over her body. And she can collect and put on her scopa, which are these white hairs on the underside of her body. And here you can see a little bee anesthetized. She's not dead. She's been just knocked out with a little CO2 for an experiment. So let me show you this kind of in real time. Here's a video, of a honeybee visiting alfalfa flowers. And honeybees don't like that tripping mechanism, so they don't trip the flowers. If you notice, you don't see any green or yellow kind of popping on the front side of those flowers as she visits. So she's getting nectar, but she's not collecting any pollen. Now let's look at our little leaf-cutting bee. This is in real time. They are wiggly and they are fast and they are adorable. And bang, she just tripped both of those flowers and she's covered in pollen. So I slowed this down a little bit for you in this video. So the first part is still real time, and then it slows down when it goes to the close-up. Slow down a little bit there too. Now you can see, bang, just tripped that flower. Look at all that pollen on that little girl. So cute. So that's why they're so special at what they do for pollinating the alfalfa flowers. So where do we get these bees? Well, in Canada, they produce them really well. They don't put as many bees out as the US farmers. They put out fewer bees, but they get 300 times back, the 300% return, so 3 times back. So if they put out 100, they get back 300 individual like offspring. So in the US, the return is low, and usually 30 to 50% of what they put out, they get back. So if they put out 100 bees, they get back only 50 as brood. And a few areas we do pretty good job in the US. It just depends on Well, we don't always know what it depends on. Some of it's environmental, some of it is management intensity. But let me show you a little bit of what this looks like in the field. This is me setting out an experimental block, but you can see I'm covered in bees. I'm not getting stung. They don't sting, they don't attack. They're just landing on me because I look like, just anything else you could land on. I'm in the way. And so the bees nest in these polystyrene boards, and these trays on top, these cardboard trays, is where the bees were incubated. And then once they started hatching out, the grower put the bees right on top of the bee boards that they want the bees to nest in. And these shelters are in the alfalfa fields. So US growers put 45 to 60,000 bees per acre out into their fields. Now, remember, I said there were 400 females per acre for osmia bees, and that's about 1,000 individuals per acre. This is 45 to 60,000 bees per acre. Quite a dramatic difference in management. This is a tray of bees that have just hatched out. We were just releasing. Here's a little close-up of that just to kind of show you what it looks like. It's very crackly when they're still chewing out. It's kind of fun. Here's some different shelter types that are from the West, and even this one in the far right is the one out of Canada. Just different styles, different people, different climates, different reasons that they do them the way that they do. And then at the end of the summer, you bring all those boards in, and so you have stacks and stacks, of polystyrene boards on pallets. And you want to clean them all out to where you have the loose cocoons like we just saw with the orchard bees. So how do you do that? Well, they invented machines to do that. And so here's the horizontal version of a punch out machine. So this board is being ratcheted through the system, and debris is being sucked off, and while the cocoons are dropping down into like a bucket. Here's a vertical version of that with 2 boards at a time being punched out. Here's a close-up of the little projections, the tines that are used to punch through. You punch from the front because of the nest, because that's where the males are. So if you're going to kill any, you're going to kill the boys, not the girls, because the girls are the ones that are doing most of the pollinating. And then eventually you end up with your alfalfa seed production, which is the whole point of doing all this work. And this is the way to go. This is the mainstream way to go for pollinating alfalfa for seed production. So what can you do to have bees in your backyard? Well, you can make sure they have what they need. So open soil areas for ground nesting bees, but also moist soil if you hope to have osmia bees or other spring bees that use soil for their nests. You also have to have the flowers for them. And then stems that they can nest in. So like old raspberry stems are good for pith nesting bees, pith stem nesting bees. And so just kind of a messier yard is better for if you want bee habitat. And you also might have some other visitors in your habitat, like these deer visiting the sweet clover that we were using for our project in North Logan. Here's on my back porch, I put out osmia bees and some nesting tubes, and they love it there because my neighbors have lots of fruit trees, and we all have little wet patches because the snow has just melted and the yards are still wet. So I have a great time watching my bees. So do my cats. They like to watch them flying back and forth. So at any age, I hope that you will appreciate the bees that you get to see in your backyard, or maybe if you get to visit some agriculture and see them hard at work producing the food that you love. And I want to finally close by reading a little poem I wrote. And it kind of sums up the whole talk. And the title of the whole story are All the Reasons That Be. And so here, this little chapter is all the beautiful reasons that be. And this is from what the mother bee would say. I lay my eggs that hatch into larvae that eat and grow until they are pupae. Pupae inside of their hardened cocoons transform to adults that emerge to fly soon. Though I will never see my offspring take flight, I know of their beauty, and in that I delight. And then there's all the nutritious reasons that be. So the foraging bee said, we'll go out among flowers, hunting nectar and pollen, lured by scents and colors before petals have fallen. Our bodies will transport the bounty we've taken to fresh open flowers for fertilization. Good humans will beam with delight at our deeds, since our visits deliver fresh fruits, nuts, and seeds. And then there's all the special reasons that be. And the specialist bee said, I am special. I am great. For particular flowers, I pollinate. I move my body on flowers just so, placing the pollen where it needs to go. Efficiently working in complex crop systems, I'll reliably perform with natural precision. And then all of the perilous reasons that be. And the foraging bee said, we walk and I'm sorry, we fly and we walk and we dig and we groom in landscapes where many dangers may loom. Parasites, pathogens, and poisons are found in flowers, on leaves, and even in the ground. We need safe harbor and a variety of food to assure crop pollination and provisions for brood. And lastly, for all the reasons that be, the people said, to bees, we are grateful for food on our plate that makes us grow strong and also taste great. Veggies and fruit, nuts and seeds result from bee visits that meet flower needs. Bees help make cheese, yogurt, and ice cream, since alfalfa seeds need a pollinator team. Special, amazing, beautiful, diverse are words to describe the bees on our earth. We will provide for more bees at our places by planting them flowers and providing safe spaces. So with that, I'm going to close. I've talked on enough. Please contact me if you want to ask me more questions at the USDA, and just be yourself. I enjoyed talking to you today.
Thank you so much, Teresa. That was beautiful. That was a great presentation. I even learned a lot. I learned a lot, actually. Thank you so much for being here. Really appreciate your time. I know you're super busy because you're almost heading into crop season soon.
Yeah, we're heading up to Washington Cherries is our next stop. Yep, we're ready to go.
Ready to go. Yeah, it's amazing. Please submit your questions and we'll ask Teresa some questions if you have them. That would be awesome. And I just want to take a minute to thank Teresa for this beautiful necklace she made me. She hand makes necklaces. It's a passion. And there's a bee. Can you tell us what the bee, because you took the picture too?
No, it's one of your photographs. I just stole. It's a solitary bee. It's a halictidae. It's I never can say the name, Oglochloropody. Yeah, so it's not a halictid, but it's a sweat bee. But they're really glistening, golden, beautiful bees. And in your backyard, that's your flower and your bee.
Thank you so much. I love it. Thank you so much. We do have a few questions. From Neil, let's see. What time of year do solitary bees start to nest? If I were to provide a bee motel, do I have to take any precautions for winter protection? And he's here in Cincinnati. So.
Sure. Yeah. So as long as I think like my bees, they can stay out on my back porch the whole time or in my garage. You just want to make sure they're not getting blasted by like snow and wind. And, normally these bees would be nesting in like a tree trunk or somewhere that they really are protected from the extremes of the environment. If they're in the ground temperature stays really constant, more so than you might think. It's just the top layer that changes a lot. So I would think, the bees that are nesting in your yard are adapted for your climate. If you're moving them from somewhere else, you might want to be a little more protective and maybe take your small block of nests and put them in the refrigerator starting around as soon as temperatures start to cool, get down, around 40 degrees, just put them at constant 40, and that would just assure that you have them. And then once you start seeing flowers come out and it's warming up, it's probably safe to bring them out. The summer bees will take a long time to come out because they don't like to do anything until it's over 70 degrees. So it just depends on the bees you have. Spring bees will warm up faster at temperatures lower than a summer bee.
Okay, great question. And I have from Lisa a true or false question. I read native bees are the only bees able to pollinate tomatoes is the first question. Also, honeybees cannot do sonication, I guess the vibrating.
Yeah. It's also called buzz pollination.
Buzz pollination.
So the way they do this thing is that they vibrate their flight muscles. So it's kind of they get on the flower and they go zzz, like they get all tense and like flex all their muscles and make their bodies vibrate. It also is a way to heat themselves up. So no, honeybees don't do that on flowers, and that's a little bit problematic. They can visit flowers and kind of maybe knock stuff around and force pollen to kind of come out. But you can take like a tuning fork and you'll go ding, and that vibration, I forget what the tune is, and you can touch the flower with that vibrating tuning fork and get the same effect as buzz pollination. But really, bumblebees, which are wild bees or commercial bees, can be very effective at buzz pollination. I think some carpenter bees can. I don't know of all the bees that can do that, but there are certain bees like the blueberry bee that's in the southeast. It's really good at pollinating blueberries, which that sonication is very effective at helping to release those pollens as well, but they don't have to be released that way. So it depends on the crop. But yeah, honeybees are not the best pollinator, but people still use them because they'll get something done. So it's true and false.
True and false. That's great.
Yeah.
From Diana, thank you for this great presentation. I am curious, are there any types of bees that, whoops, it moved. Are there any types of bees that do not provide any value in regards to human food supply? Do they have a different purpose? I don't think so.
Yeah, well, it's not all about humans and it's not all about human food, So for instance, I'll tell you, there's a specialist bee that visits the death camas, and that's a flower that's toxic. I think it's toxic to cattle and things like that. You don't necessarily want it on your rangeland. And if bees in general visit this flower, they don't like it and it will kill them. And so they don't use it. But this specialist bee, for whatever reason, has evolved to detoxify those toxins, and they can use it. So that flower is propagated because a bee comes and pollinates it, but that bee has co-evolved and they both live in harmony, out of the wildlands, because that's what they do. It's a native plant. Mm-hmm. And so not everything is about people and not everything is about food production, but yeah, so yeah, I mean, I guess she's right. Not all bees are any good at doing anything for us for food, but my family always says like, well, what good is it? Well, depends on who you are and who's asking and why, So do we love the species on Earth and want to protect our diversity? Well, then all of them are special and all of them are necessary. If you only care about, your crop production today for your field, no, not all of them are doing the job for you.
Great, thank you. From Graham, what is the incubation temperature to stall or hold bobs? And I'd like you to clarify bobs because people are going to be, what's a bob?
Yeah,
I want one of those. I remember when I first heard it, I'm like, oh my God, a bob cell. What kind of, I want a bob. So I know if we can clarify bob and what temperature to bring about emergence.
Yeah, so all right, so bobs are the blue orchard bee. Mm-hmm. And so Osmia lignaria is the blue orchard bee. So we store them at around like refrigerator temperature, 40 degrees Fahrenheit, 4 degrees C. So, or Celsius. They can be stored a little bit higher temperature, just a little bit higher if you want to get them out, extra soon. Like if you're using a Utah bee to pollinate in California, where spring is going to come sooner in California. So you bump the temperature up as you get closer to bloom time. But because they're adults in cocoons, you don't want them too warm because you'll burn up their fat stores, so that when it comes time for them to chew out of the cocoon, they might be too weak because they've been too warm and their bodies have been metabolically active. So you have to kind of keep them like that bear hibernating in the cave. You got to keep them asleep or they're going to use up all that fat. So 4 degrees and even down to 0. So 32 degrees, Fahrenheit. I keep switching back and forth. 30, so freezing is also okay. And you can store them longer at that temperature. Males will start hatching out even at refrigerator temperatures because they're so eager to go and they got to go or they're just going to perish. So to heat them up, room temperature, just in your house, around 70 degrees. If you want them to hatch faster, you can bump them up to around 80, but around 70 is good enough. Yeah, hope that helps.
Yeah, no. And there's another question from Joe. Is there a relationship between the amount of flowers in the foraging range and the number of eggs laid by the females?
Um, yeah, I could see a correlation in that. And so a female is, females make pretty much one egg a day. What's going on inside their body, they could lay one egg a day. For leaf cutting bees, we've seen some bees lay 3 eggs in a day, and I'm not sure how they're doing that. But um, if they have to go a long way to get flowers because the flowers are dispersed or a long way from where they're trying to nest, then it'll take them a long time to get enough nectar and pollen in that nest to get that egg laid on that day. And they'll also kind of wear themselves out. But if there's a lot of local forage, even if it's just a patch, and they can, so like for leaf cutting bees, they need 400 flowers in order to make one of those nest provisions. And they can do that in the morning. They can get it all ready to go and lay the egg and seal it off and be ready to start the next one the next day. Or actually be even starting late in the day, long summer days, already preparing for the next day. So it is dependent on flower density, but also locality, how far away they have to go, and the risks that are taken to be away from the nest for a long time. Parasites have time to get in, so all kinds of things can happen depending on where you have to go go to the grocery store to get the food for your kids.
That's a good way to look at it. We have a carpenter bee question. How do carpenter bees help, and how can we live in harmony with them, since they tend to be destructive? We always get a carpenter bee question at every webinar.
I mean, if you live in the East, I never see them here out West, but I'm from Tennessee. If you can't tell, I'm not from here. So I love carpenter bees. They're really cool, but they do weaken structures because they dig holes all through them. So you could give them an alternative place to be. One way to keep them out is to, refresh the paint on your deck or wherever it is they're nesting and stuff, seal off the holes. You can even kill some I've heard you can activate like an old flea collar and stuff it in there and kind of kill everything in there so it doesn't come out. But they are good at pollinating flowers. Sometimes they even nectar rob, but which means they pierce the flower and steal the nectar and stuff. But they do certain flowers they are good pollinators for, and some people down in the tropics will actually propagate them for crop pollination. And so Natalie has just said in the chat, I saw it popped up, Penn State has a whole article on the good things about or the stuff, information about carpenter bees. They're not all bad, but yeah, I mean, leaf cutting bees, if you have them in your yard, will cut some of the flowers, cut petals of some of the flowers that you appreciate intact, not all cut up by leaf cutting bees. So it's just, depends on what you value as a homeowner, and what, you can switch to some hardy board or those other kind of not real woods, and then let the bees have the real wood.
That'd be great. I also, just one last question. Do we run out of time for questions? Because we have a cicada from Christina. We have our 17-year cicada emergence coming up in a few months. Would they be a problem with the bees, or they won't?
Nah, they don't use pollen and nectar. Those adults will come out, lay their eggs in twigs. They kind of pierce twigs and trees and stuff, and then those nymphs will crawl down the trees, get in the soil and get in the ground and chew on like your turf, but that's not going to bother the bees. And I don't even think the ground nesting bees, I've never heard of that, but that's kind of interesting to think about. I don't think so though.
Oh, great. Thank you for everyone's questions. We really appreciate it. And
this was lots of fun.
Oh, I just love having you here. Thank you so much. This is wonderful. And can you tell us a little bit about your publication?
Yeah, this is a bee book that we put out. Dr. James and I put out around, I think it was 2008. And so we wanted to connect some of those solitary bees to agriculture, kind of like what I presented to you today, but a better understanding of that for the general public. And so there's different chapters by different authors who are specialists in their field. So there's an Osmia chapter or Osmia lingera chapter, and there's also a leaf cutting bee chapter. But also there's information about bumblebees and other bees in the system and how they're used in the systems for various things. So it's a good book for, I would say, students and towards scholars, maybe not as friendly for the general public, but it's still tons of good information and written for, it's not over the top science. So it's a good book, I think.
Fantastic. We'd like to wrap up, and thank you so much again,
Yes.
Theresa, for sharing your knowledge and expertise. Your work is inspiring and gives us hope for a better future for bees. I just really appreciate you being here. Be sure to check your inboxes and your emails. A copy of this recording will be there tomorrow, and links to find out more about orchard bees and farming. Please don't forget to register your gardens and pots with the Cincinnati Zoo Plant for Pollinator Challenge. It's things are starting to bloom. It's been so warm here in Cincinnati. So we'd love to hear from you at the Cincinnati Zoo. And for more information how to manage blue orchard bees as a orchard pollinator, visit us at osmiabee.com. And I just thank you so much, Theresa. I really appreciate it. And thank you again to our supporters and sponsors. This is a beautiful picture. Where's this taken?
This is almond orchard.
It's an almond orchard with mason bees or bobs.
Yep.
Out busy pollinating.
Yep. Female on the right, male on the left. They were just released. They're really hungry. They went to get a good drink of nectar right after hatching.
Well, we have to have you back because we ran out of time and I still have a million questions.
I don't know anything else. That's it.
Yo, you know more. And it's just some great comments from, some people here. And it's just, thank you so much. Great presentation. From Dr. Natalie Boyle, Penn State, like you said, just registered. We'll put up these links for our listeners so they can get more information. So we thank you. A lot of Karen says, love your creative poetry. Thanks for the presentation. Great. I need to leave for work. Oh, so she left for work. But some really wonderful comments here. And thank you, Theresa. We really appreciate you. And I look forward to seeing you this spring and summer. We'll see you soon.
I'm going to be around.
Well, thank you. And again, thank you to all our listeners and being here on the Pollinator Report. Thank you again, Dr. Theresa Pitts-Singer.
You're
Take
welcome.
care and have
bye, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.